Good day, everybody. I'm Mike Eisenstadt, Director of the Military and Security Studies Program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and welcome to this virtual policy forum on Iran's military drone program, security implications, and policy responses. Iran's drone program has emerged in recent years as a game changer in the Middle East and has played a major role in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. It is not an exaggeration to say that they've already had strategic effects with regard to Iran's drone attack on Aramco in 2019, Houthi drone attacks on the United Arab Emirates in February of 2022, and as I mentioned more recently, in the conflict in Ukraine, when Iranian drones used by Russian forces have inflicted significant damage on Ukrainian infrastructure. So to discuss this topic, we have three excellent speakers today: General Kenneth McKenzie, Damien Spleeters, and Valerie Lincy. General McKenzie served for over 40 years in uniform in the U.S. Marine Corps, was commissioned as an infantryman, and held senior positions with the Joint Staff and U.S. Central Command, which he commanded from 2019 to 2022. He is currently executive director of both the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida and the Florida Center for Cybersecurity. He is also author of one of our more recent policy notes, Striking Back: Iran and the Rise of Asymmetric Drone Warfare in the Middle East. He will be followed by Damien Spleeters, who is Deputy Director of Operations at Conflict Armament Research. His most recent publications assess Iranian drones used by Russia in Ukraine and the supply chains that sustain these capabilities. He has previously written about improvised weapons and component supply chains in Iraq and Syria. And it's not his most recent writing on this topic, but one of his main contributions to this discussion is dissecting Iranian drones employed by Russia in Ukraine. Finally, Valerie Lincy is Executive Director of the Wisconsin Project on Nuclear Arms Control and oversees its Iran Watch website. Her most recent publication is the Roundtable Report, Clipping Tehran's Wings: How Supply-Side Controls Can Impede the Iranian Drone Program. And I think links to both Valerie's and Damien's studies can be found in the chat box on your screen. And likewise, General McKenzie's study that he did for the Washington Institute is available on the website of the Washington Institute. I just also want to mention that after the presentations, we'll have a short discussion followed by questions and answers from the audience. So we do welcome questions from our viewers. If you'd like to ask questions of our panelists during the event, please enter the questions into the Zoom question and answer function below your screen. Or if you're watching this policy forum on our website or YouTube, you can email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. That's policyforum, that's one word, at WashingtonInstitute, that's one word.org. Okay, so before starting, what I would like to do is, I think many of our members of our audience are quite familiar with this topic, but some might be less so. So I've prepared a graphic here. If you could load the slide with the images of Iran's drones. And I have just two PowerPoint slides which show Iran's drones to show the variety that they come in and the different sizes they come in. Okay, next page, please. Okay, so here are pictures of the Shahed 131 and Shahed 136 drones. On the top left, you see a picture of a Shahed 131 with President Zelensky of Ukraine, just to get a sense of the size of this. Both of these drones are delta wing drones. They're kamikaze drones, which means they're one-way drones. They kind of dive into their target. As a result, they don't have any landing gear. And you can see on the bottom right, Iran has developed on kind of dump truck type of erector launcher, a multiple drone launcher that enables them to, in quick succession, launch drones in salvos that can then act as swarms as they approach the target. So again, these are kind of like basically two versions of the same model, one slightly larger with a larger payload and longer range than the other. Next slide, please. And then here we have the Shahed 129 in the top left. the Mohajer 6 on the right, and the Arash 2 at the bottom. The Shahid and the Mohajer are kind of more traditional drones that they have landing gear, so they take off like an airplane from the ground, and they can both conduct reconnaissance missions as well as strike missions. You could see actually on the Shahid and the Mohajer under the wings, you could see that they have munitions there. Whereas the Arash is like the Shahid 131 and 136. It's a kamikaze drone, so it doesn't have landing gear. It takes off from, if you see, they're mounted on launch stands on a flatbed truck that they take off of, and you see one of the drones is taken off there on a one-way mission. So anyhow, this is, and Iran has many more drones than this. This is just to give you a sense. These are the most important ones. And I mentioned before the Shahid 131 and 136 and the Mohajer 6 have been transferred to Russia and been used in Ukraine. Likewise, the Shahid 131 and 136 have been used against ships in the area of the Persian Gulf and in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. Anyhow, that completes our primer on Iran's drones. And I would like to now invite General McKenzie to start our presentations. General McKenzie, it's all yours.
Mike, thanks very much. That was a great introduction. I'm excited to be part of this forum today because I think this is a very important topic, and it's becoming increasingly relevant, not only in the Middle East, which is my particular area of expertise, but as we see and as you have discussed in Ukraine as well, where this technology has been exported and is actually having a battlefield effect. So I would like to take just a minute to talk about how drones fit into what Iran is doing, the history of it, and how we kind of got to this point. Drone warfare is an asymmetric approach to warfare. Typically, it's the tool of an entity, a state, that isn't able to field, modern fighter aircraft, other high-end capability systems. So you look for innovative alternatives. The drone, the land attack cruise missile that Iran uses, and some of their ballistic missiles all sort of fall into this niche. The strategy of a power that is overmatched in many domains, but seeks to find innovative ways to respond and to respond effectively. And also the ability to respond, particularly in the case of drones, that give you a measure of deniability about where the drone actually emanated from. And I'll talk about that here in just a minute. The other virtue of pursuing things like drones is you don't need actually cutting edge technology in order to do it. Our combat systems and the combat systems of many of our allies are, in fact, very highly technically advanced systems. Drones typically are not technically advanced systems. They can be used with older systems and less than perfect technological solutions to the problem that they're confronting. But it gives a lot of flexibility to the entity that uses them, and that's very important. So over the last 10 years, in particular, I would argue that Iran has massively increased their inventory of drones, their inventory of cruise missiles, more recently cruise missiles, and of course, ballistic missiles. To think about how drones would be employed and their role in a theater engagement in the Middle East, you need to consider the other two systems as well. So let me briefly sketch what a potential conflict could look like before we particularize some policy stuff and other things associated with Iran. A war in the Middle East will not be a maneuver war. Tanks aren't going to roll. Infantrymen aren't going to go forward. No one's probably going to invade anybody else because nobody really has an expeditionary military. And Iran certainly does not have an expeditionary military there. What it will do instead, what it will be is what first person I heard say this was General Jim Mattis back when he was the CENTCOM commander, a fires war. It'll be a war where drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles are applied against military targets, but also against non-military targets. So to use the term of art from strategic warfare, counter force and counter value. And the beauty of using drones is you can employ them across the entire spectrum of conflict. You can employ them at the very, very low level in a deniable or a partially deniable way, or you can employ them with state-on-state warfare where they can be used to pave the way for your other larger systems, such as your ballistic missiles that will follow. So this is where we are now in the Middle East. Iran has systematically built up its capabilities for drones, for land attack cruise missiles, and for ballistic missiles, to a point where now in the late spring of 2023, they effectively have an overmatch capability against their neighbors. And by overmatch, I mean the ability to attack a country to a degree where that country's defenses will be overwhelmed and they'll not be able to prevent the attack that's coming. Now, how that attack would develop, the Iranians have a lot of choices here because they built the equivalent of combined arms warfare in the air. Your drones can go in first. You look for the radar systems, maybe Patriot radars, maybe other radars that you look to take down with the drones. Because frankly, a Patriot is not optimized to shoot at a drone. You can do it, not the way we'd prefer to do it. And with really, really small drones, it does actually become very difficult to do. Now, we have other ways to defend our Patriots, kinetic systems, gun systems, even electronic systems that we employ. But right now, we're lagging behind the drone's ability to penetrate us. The whole history of warfare is one of offense and defense. And right now, the advantage is with the drones. They have an advantage that we have not yet been able to completely counter. So this war would be a war of fires. Military targets, non-military targets, all of these things would be in play. And that's a significant difference in Iranian capability. And I'll tell you, the Iranians are actually, they've proven to be pretty good and effective. The attack that Mike referenced on the Saudi oil facilities in the fall of 2019 was exquisitely accurate and very, very effective. The attack against our forces at Al-Assad in January 2020 using ballistic missiles was in fact highly accurate. Those missiles hit within tens of meters of their targets. And the only reason that we didn't take loss of life was we had the ability to make some adjustments before those missiles were fired. But the Iranians actually hit with remarkable accuracy the targets that they shot at. So I actually have great respect for the Iranian drone, cruise missile, and ballistic missile program. They have made great sacrifices over the last 10 years in order to build these systems up. In fact, I would go so far to say, and this is my opinion, not related to the U.S. government or anyone else, I believe these capabilities actually reflect the true crown jewels of Iran. I think these capabilities are at least as important to them as the nuclear program, because the nuclear program is a contingent future development of a nuclear weapon. They could sprint to it. They could go to it very quickly. But today, this afternoon, they actually have the ability to hurt their neighbors very badly should they choose to do that. And I think it's worth remembering as we consider the totality of their program. I think it's a very concerning thing. And in fact, you may recall, and I've mentioned this in the paper that I wrote, when President-elect Biden in the fall of after the election, but before he was sworn in, made a comment about wanting to move forward with the JICPOA and then turning to Iranian try to limit ballistic missiles and other systems. The Iranian response was harsh and electric, and it wasn't centered on the JICPOA and future JICPOA negotiations. Instead, they talked about their missiles, their drones, and their other systems, which they swore they'd never give up. So I think sometimes people say what they mean, and you can listen to the Iranian position on that, but I do believe they very much value these capabilities. So if that's sort of the situation that you've got with Iran, how does that fit into the larger theater, and what can we do about it? So actually, we have an opportunity here. We've already discussed the possibility that a future war with Iran would be a fires war, not a maneuver war. Therefore, if you're going to defend against this type of activity, you need an integrated air and missile defense approach to do that. That has been a dream of CENTCOM commanders going back many, many years. I believe that for a couple of reasons now, we're on the cusp of being able to take some of the first nation steps to developing that. Because here's the thing, in the Middle East, what countries don't like to do is give up anything that affects their sovereignty. By that, I mean troops stationed in their country, or they being required to station troops in another country. Things like that aren't particularly popular. Well, you don't have to do that for integrated air and missile defense. What you actually have to do is share information. You need to build what we call a common operational picture, a shared understanding of the airspace that is above the region, so that should the Iranians attack, you will have the ability to rapidly share that information so that whomever is threatened can act more quickly in order to respond to that threat. And over the past several years, we have worked very hard to increase the level of trust amongst these nations. And we've had some success at that. The other big factor that I think is simply something that we need to recognize as a key part of this is the entry of Israel into the Central Command AOR, Area Responsibility. For many years, Israel had been part of the European Command. And as President Trump left office, in the Unified Command Plan, he chose to move Israel into the Central Command region. Now, the fact of the matter is, for many years, Central Command has done a lot of business with the state of Israel because their threats emanate from the east and not from the west. But bringing them formally into the combatant command gives us an opportunity then to more effectively integrate them with the militaries of other nations in the region. And I think that's very important. And we've seen this actually, as I noted just a moment ago, we've seen this actually begin. And I think it's a great step forward. At the military level, many of these things are happening. We are able to share information. We're able to work common tactics, techniques, and procedures. Now, I don't want to oversell it. I don't want to put on rose-colored glasses and paint a picture of untrammeled optimism about the future. But I do think we have a path forward here. The next step would logically be political commitments, and that may take a while to get to. Every nation in the region has a slightly different approach to this, and these old issues and concerns about giving up secrets, loss of national sovereignty, still remain endemic, and we just need to realize that. But we do have an opportunity here to bring people together collectively against what is the most pressing threat in the region. And the most pressing threat in the region is the Iranian ability to orchestrate combined air attacks from the sky, ballistic missiles, land attack cruise missiles, and of course drones. And of those three, the one that is the most persistent across the spectrum of engagement is the drone. Because as I've noted earlier, you can employ it in high-end warfare, you can employ it in deniable warfare, proxy warfare, as we've seen done many times in Iraq against U.S. and NATO forces there, and in other places across the region. And of course, the classic example of the Houthis firing drones and ballistic missiles into Saudi Arabia, weapon systems that Iran would try to deny it, but they're certainly morally responsible at a minimum for the development, deployment, and execution of those attacks. So where we are right now is this: we're in a new phase of warfare, a phase where in the region in particular, but in other places as well, the unchallenged air supremacy that the United States and its allies have largely enjoyed since the middle of the Second World War is no longer uncontested. There are things that fly in the region, in the central region, that we would prefer not to be above our bases. We cannot always prevent that. We're getting better. And we get better through, we already talked about, a collective approach to air defense in the region. And there are also technical solutions that we need to continue to work on. Against large drones, it's an airplane. It's an airplane type system. You can employ traditional air defense against it. And they typically have a large radar cross section so you can see them. What is more worrisome, of course, are the smaller drones, which are getting better every day. You can buy them cheaply. You can modify them easily. You can launch them from places that are perhaps close to the targets. You got to convey them to those locations, but that's a challenge that has been met by our opponents in the region, and they've had some success doing that. So you defend against that by, again, the combination of technical and policy means. In the technical field, kinetics, non-kinetics. You would like to actually, when you think about defending against drones, you'd like to start way back, and others are going to talk about it, in the supply chain before those weapons actually are in the field. But once they're in the field, you want to know where they are so that you can very quickly go after potential launching sites, know where they're coming from. You want to be able to detect the platform once it's in the air. Now, if it talks off, maybe uses GPS navigation, that may give you an ability to do that, might not. If it uses completely inertial navigation, very hard to see it because nothing is emanating from that platform. So now you're down to, are you going to be able to get a sensor paint on it? By that, I mean, are you going to be able to physically see it with your radar? Are you going to be able to detect it with infrared? Hard to do because the engine's small compared to the motor of a rocket or even a land attack cruise missile. So a variety of kinetic things are out there that let us get after it, ranging from all the way at point of launch. As you get closer to impact, you would like to jam it if you can, if it's available, if it has some kind of way that lets you get to it. If not, you may be reduced to kinetic means, striking it with short-range missile, with cannon air defense artillery, or even with another drone, as we've seen begin to be employed in Ukraine. And I think we may see that as one of the ways that go forward. So I'll conclude my remarks by saying this. Iran has built up a remarkable capability with its fleet of drones, its fleet of land attack cruise missiles, and its ballistic missiles. They directly threaten their neighbors in a way that was not the case 10 or even 5 years ago. And they continue to build these capabilities. They will only get better as they have an opportunity to export these capabilities to Ukraine, where their Russian partners can fly them and test them. And then in return, and I don't know the details of this, perhaps others do, I'm certain Iran is going to get significant assistance from the Russians to actually make technical improvements to their fleet that we will probably see employed in the region in the weeks, months, and years ahead. So we have a challenge. We're meeting that challenge. We need to continue to do it. We need action at the policy level. We need to continue our press within the Department of Defense for technical solutions to this. And I know that the Secretary is completely committed to this, and I believe we're making adjustments. The advantage, though, today probably still lies with the offense. But in the long history of warfare, we've learned that if you focus on the problem, you can catch up. And I believe we'll have the ability to do that. Mike, thanks, and I will pause there.
Thank you, General McKenzie. Damien, Spleeters.
Thanks so much, Mike, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and discuss this topic with such prestigious speakers. And thank you, General McKenzie, for your remarks. I just wanted to, first allude to the different ways you mentioned to counter Iranian drones, and one of which, as you said, was to look at the supply chains of the items and components that are necessary to building those drones. And this is what conflict armament research is doing. And also to the necessity of sharing information on those drones. And I think this is crucial for us also to include industry, as we see that the components mostly are commercially available. So we need the cooperation from industry, manufacturers and distributors to trace the chains of custody, the chains of supply of these components, and shed some light onto the acquisition networks used by Iran. And so this is what my presentation will be about today. So I'm going to share my screen now. There you go. Before I start, I wanted to also allude to something you said, General McKenzie, about potential deniability from Iran. And this, I don't think this is a point that you delve into too much, but this is something that we looked at, and perhaps we can discuss it, during the Q&A later together. But the first thing for us was to determine whether the drones were effectively Iranian. Because there were some public remarks by Iran saying that first they weren't theirs, they were not Iranians, and then they said that they may have given some drones to Russia before the start of the invasion. So the first thing we did when we were in Ukraine in November was to conduct a visual comparison between the drones that we had documented in Ukraine and some systems that we had documented in the Middle East and linked to Iran previously since 2017. And then just recently in January, we finally got confirmation that those drones were effectively Iranian by actually documenting the name of an Iranian company on several engines that we had seen together with those drones, and this is going to be the subject of a future report for us. But to the topic here, Conflict Armament Research, for those who don't know about us, is an independent research organization that is investigating the diversion of commodities in conflicts. And effectively, what it means is that we are sending investigators to conflicts to document items recovered in person for the purpose of tracing their chains of supply and identify patterns of diversion. This means that our teams will take detailed pictures, as you can see here in the short video, of all the items and their components, so that we can trace them with their manufacturers based on serial or lot numbers. Each dot on this map represents a location where conflict armament research field investigation teams have documented recovered items. We've worked in Ukraine since 2018 to document and trace the components of weapons systems used by Russia. Our work since February 2022, since the invasion, has made clear that Russian and Iranian weapons are heavily reliant on Western components and technologies. So far, our teams documented the components found in more than 100 Russian manufactured weapons and equipment items, such as drones, missiles, satellite navigation systems, and radios. And we also documented the components of more than 20 Iranian manufactured systems, including the Shaheds 136 and 131 that Mike referred to at the very beginning of this presentation, and also the Mohajir 6 and the KM5 precision-guided munition. In Russian systems, we've documented more than 2,000 components of over 650 different models, bearing the brand of about 150 non-Russian companies, more than half of which are incorporated in the United States, roughly 20% incorporated in Europe, and 20% in Asia. We've identified the year of manufacture of more than 60% of these components, and almost 80% of these were manufactured between 2014 and 2021, which highlights the stockpiling efforts made by Russia prior to its invasion of Ukraine. And perhaps you've seen the very recent report we've just published about the fact that our teams, for the first time, have documented components that were made after the invasion. We documented 3 Lancet munitions that included such components. So for us, that's a turning point in the conflicts, which might show that Russia may be running low on the stocks that they had prior to the invasion. In Iranian systems, we've documented more than 500 components of over 200 different models, bearing the brands of more than 70 non-Iranian companies. And in fact, you can see the Shahed 131 on the picture there. The only thing that's Iranian in the system is the engine, really. More than 80% of the components that we have documented, they bear the marks of companies incorporated in the United States. So that's more than 80% here. And many of these components have been recently manufactured, including a large number that were produced in 2020 and 2021. Most of these components are electronic components, but we also documented engines, antennas, and other parts crucial to weapon systems. Within a small time frame, we have also observed efforts to decrease supply chain footprints in Iranian systems. We've documented variants in 3 key modules found in the Iranian drones used by Russia and Ukraine, including their software-defined radios, their inertial measurement units, and their onboard computers. These variants denote a significant leap in Iranian engineering, particularly for expendable systems, while further increasing Iran's resilience to sanctions. Any use of higher-end components would lead to an increased footprint in equivalent networks, and therefore more vulnerability to disruption. And some of the variants that we have documented use selected components that are less controllable or not subject to export restrictions. Even if the use of these components may lead to inferior capabilities in the Iranian drones, these may be judged sufficient for their use in expendable weapon systems. We've observed 2 variants of Iranian software-defined radio-based advanced global navigation satellite system, for example, and they're both based around US-manufactured field programmable gate arrays, which are critical components for both Russia and Iran. And the second variant denotes better component layout, packing, and integration. We have also documented 3 variants of Iranian inertial measurement units, and you can see one variant there on the screen. There are, by knowing the dynamics of the airframe, such as acceleration, rotation, and relative motion, and using complex mathematical algorithms, these inertial measurement units can determine where the drone is and where it is going, independently of satellite navigation. And so this is critical for when you operate a drone in a denied environment, so jammed environment, for example. The most prevalent inertial measurement units that we had documented seem to be US manufactured. And this is also a version that we have found actually in Russian drones. And we have also now documented Japanese manufactured inertial measurement units and even fully custom built inertial measurement units based on Chinese components, which denotes, again, an effort to reduce supply chain footprint. And we have seen this pattern as well in the Global Navigation Satellite System board of the flight computers for the Shahed drones used in Ukraine. First variant used a ready-made board, and CAR then documented a custom-based variant centered around one commercial chip that would result in less accuracy, but is also less prone to export control. And we have also observed efforts by Iran to conceal the provenance of some components and hinder tracing efforts, for instance, by fully obliterating markings found on some items. And in some cases, we've been able to recover these serial numbers and to successfully trace them with their manufacturers. And then in conclusion, I would say that as we've seen a lot in the news lately, it may be a surprise to hear that more than 80% of the components found in Iranian drones used in Ukraine bear the brands of US-based entity, but really it shouldn't be a surprise. Due to the nature of the semiconductor industry, it should not be a surprise to find that Iran and Russia, for that matter, who don't have an advanced domestic semiconductor industry, are so reliant on non-domestic civilian electronic components. The logical assumption stemming from that observation is that Iran was able to obtain such components because the multi-layered distribution-based nature of the industry would preclude successful tracing. However, conflict armament research has already been able to identify technological choke points and diversion patterns in the Russian and Iranian acquisition mechanisms. We have been able to do this because we open up these systems in Ukraine, because we document their components and how their construction evolves, because we trace these items with their manufacturers and distributors, and we triangulate acquisition patterns. While diversion-proof control or full supply chain visibility may not be achievable, documenting and tracing the components of weapons used in Ukraine is critically important to identify such patterns, adequately respond to observed diversion, and make evidence-based decisions when it comes to due diligence and export control. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Damien. Valerie?
Thanks, Mike. And thanks also for having me participate in this panel. And thanks to my co-panelists for their very interesting presentations. As you mentioned, Mike, we did publish findings from a roundtable discussion on Iranian drones recently that touched a bit on the ways to mitigate the threat that those drones pose on the battlefield, like investing in new and more cost-effective counter UAV technologies. But the focus of the roundtable discussion was more specifically on the role of export controls and sanctions policies in targeting the supply chain for Iran's drone program. So if Iranian drones can't be kept off the battlefield, what can we do to slow their development, to make them less lethal, or to keep them where they are? And so I'm just going to review a few key sort of findings from the roundtable report that get at those questions. The first point is just to acknowledge the obvious, which is that export controls and sanctions are not going to eliminate Iran's ability to produce drones. And that shouldn't be their objective. As Damien mentioned, UAV technologies are far too widely available, commercially available, and Iran's drone industry is just too mature and well diversified thanks to the investments over time that General McKenzie mentioned. So you have a number of large state-run entities under the Ministry of Defense and the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that are responsible for sort of designing and manufacturing drones. You have a growing number of private companies inside Iran that are involved in procurement or involved in providing services to these larger state-run entities. And then you have myriad firms overseas and individuals that help Iran evade sanctions and that help with Iran to obtain UAV components. And then again, domestically, you have a deep knowledge base for ongoing research and development on drones within the Iranian universities. So that's kind of a lay of the land in terms of the various entities that are involved in the program, and explains, I think, one of the reasons why the program is as advanced as it is today. Second finding is to recognize, not to be overly optimistic, but to recognize what sanctions and export controls have achieved that have been imposed by the United States and Western countries in terms of limiting Iran's drone program. You have 4 decades plus of US economic sanctions. So even if those sanctions haven't directly targeted the drone program, they have deprived Iran's defense industries generally of resources, which hasn't completely blocked those industries, but certainly has dragged out development timelines, made it more difficult to procure items from abroad, and just generally made the program costlier to operate. So yes, Iran has ready access to a term that General McKenzie referenced in his paper, to these sort of bronze metal technologies. And that appears to be sort of good enough for their purposes for now. But I'm sure that Iran would love to have gold medal technologies if they could. And even Iran's best drones today are nowhere near the capability of a Reaper or Global Hawk. And that's partly, at least partly, due to the success of export controls and sanctions. Our report does emphasize the need to distinguish, as we think about where to focus the efforts of export controls and sanctions, the need to distinguish between low-end components and more advanced ones when we're thinking about how to interrupt Iran's supply chain. Again, as Damien mentioned, Iranian drones that have been recovered in Ukraine have been revealed to have sort of large percentage of parts coming from the United States and other Western countries. That doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to interrupt the source of that supply. These components are mostly electronics. They are widely commercially available. They have many civilian applications, and they can be purchased in large quantities, not directly from manufacturers, but from these distributors that are located around the world in China and elsewhere. Very few, none of the sort of electronic components appear on export control lists explicitly. So the better opportunity is really to focus on high-end equipment that would transform Iranian drones from the sort of bronze metal level to silver or gold. And in our report, we do list a couple of examples that, as far as we're aware, and Damien may have different information, haven't yet appeared on deployed Iranian drones. So satellite-enabled data links, higher resolution sensors, better engines, stealth technology, swarming or electronic warfare equipment. So our report outlines ways in which sanctions and export controls can kind of interrupt or at least complicate Iran's drone supply chain, and more generally, Iran's supply chain for military-related procurement. So I'll cover the export control piece first, and the short answer is catch-all controls. Very few, if any, of the parts, as I mentioned, that Iran is importing are listed by the Missile Technology Control Regime, which aims to limit the spread of missiles and drones that are capable of delivering weapons of mass destruction, or by the Wassenaar Arrangement, which aims to promote transparency in conventional arms transfers and related dual-use items transfers. But both the MTCR and the Wassenaar Arrangement do have provisions for catch-all controls, meaning you're not relying on a specific list of items that are controlled, but you're controlling the flow of goods that are not listed when there's a reason to believe that the intended end use is military or proliferation related. So the United States, the European Union, Japan, major advanced economies participate in these regimes and have national catch-all controls in place. And when you have these kind of controls, you have a legal basis to take action, direct action, based on your own investigation, or in some cases, based on information that you might receive from a partner government that could support an interdiction. Without catch-all controls in place, many countries actually lack the legal basis to take any particular action related to, for example, the denial of a license, an interdiction, or any kind of other blocking action related to Iranian drone procurement. So we spent some time in our paper talking about the value of helping countries create a legal basis to allow for the implementation of catch-all controls within their national export control regulations. And it's an area that the US and the European Union have focused on in export control capacity building and could certainly be reinforced. Capacity building could also take place kind of within the regimes. And that was another area of emphasis, the sort of in reach. So members of BASNR, members of the MTCR, these are often the countries that are the source of Iranian procurement. And so helping these countries better implement the controls that they have kind of on the books would be quite valuable. On the sanctions side of things, there's a real opportunity for expansion here. And we've seen, expansion, I would say, over the last 6 to 12 months. In particular, the value of targeting foreign suppliers to Iran's drone industry, which would at least complicate procurement efforts. And also, because a lot of the entities that are participating in this trade are participating in general, sort of general non-sensitive trade, you might deter prospective suppliers because they would see the sort of Iranian market as too risky. Taking a step back, US sanctions specifically targeting the drone program only really took effect in late 2021. The first sanctions action took place in October. So the initiative is pretty recent compared to other US sanctions on Iran. And then I mentioned earlier the diversity of entities in and out of Iran supporting the program. So there really is a sort of, there are a lot of sanctions targets in this arena. And then, as I mentioned, since last fall, we've seen really a major uptick in the targeted designations by the United States in terms of Iranian drone supporters, both inside Iran and outside Iran. Just this week, I think it was yesterday, there were a number of entities sanctioned for supplying military electronics to Iran, based in mainland China, Hong Kong, and Malaysia. And then in March, you had another network that was targeted based out of Turkey. So, the China problem, which I'll come to in a moment, is a real one, but the problem is not just China. There are a lot of other countries where we have, the United States and other countries have perhaps more leverage. I do think also that, and this here I'm departing a bit from our roundtable findings, but there is an opportunity, I think, for the European Union to do a bit more on sanctions. There hasn't really been an independent effort by the European Union to target Iran's drone industry and foreign suppliers. And it's not clear that there's a obvious legal basis to do so. So there's been a focus on the sort of supply to Russia and use of Iranian drones in Ukraine, but not an effort to target the Iranian drone program in its entirety. And I think that would be valuable, both because the EU is a source of supply for Iran, but also because it would help, it would change the way I think countries perceive of these sanctions, which right now they're often seen as kind of just a US initiative, and it would help kind of multilateralize things and make countries, illustrate that the threat is seen by many countries in the same way. Just a few points on China that did come up with sort of a separate finding in our roundtable discussion. China presents a number of different challenges. China is a major problem of indirect supply for Western goods. So this is the Chinese distributor problem. There was a chain of custody investigation a while ago by the United Nations related to Iranian weapons used by the Houthis, which found that engines and a number of other components were manufactured in the West, transited through China, and wound up in these drones that the Houthis had received from Iran. China is a problem as a direct source of supply, Chinese entities supplying Chinese-made drone components. And then there have been an increasing number of joint ventures between Chinese and Iranian entities. This may be the understatement of the panel, but Chinese government is not, export enforcement is not a high priority for the Chinese government. Even less likely to be a high priority when we're talking about controlling, unlisted items. that are not covered by don't meet the threshold of multilateral export control regimes. So what can we do? Couple of suggestions in our paper: direct engagement with individual Chinese companies that do have a presence and want to trade or do trade with the United States. Sanctions will presumably have some cost to these companies, and so can you engage with them directly? Direct engagement with US companies and companies in partner countries that use Chinese distributors, focusing them on sort of the risks of that, encouraging them to increase due diligence, potentially using sanctions. And then more public campaigns in general, the reports that CAR puts out, media reports, just general name and shame campaigns when you see companies when you continue to see items produced by Western manufacturers turning up in Iranian drones, months and months and months after sanctions have taken effect, maybe it's time for a bit more of a public campaign. Just to wrap up, clearly there is not a silver bullet here or one particular way to eliminate the Iranian drone threat, but a multilateral, multi-pronged approach would certainly help contain it. Focusing on cutting off higher end items through better export controls, increased intelligence sharing. This connects to some points that General McKenzie made in his paper. Intelligence sharing, opening up information that helps to support interdictions would be very valuable. Working with industry, as Damien said, here and abroad to improve due diligence, in some cases engaging new types of companies that don't have a lot of experience with export controls, but whose goods are wrapped up in all of this trade. And then on the lower end items where it's harder to really choke things off entirely, at least trying through capacity building to kind of broaden the net, make countries understand the nature of the threat, how Iranian procurement works, so that even if it's still possible for things to get through the net is a bit wider. And it does seem as if the war in Ukraine is providing an impetus for some kind of multilateral cooperation on these types of actions. And that didn't really exist before. So having some kind of a consensus on the nature of this threat and the need to counter it is very valuable. That consensus existed on the nuclear program, and it allowed for a lot of multilateral action on the nuclear program all these years. But again, Iran has devoted at least as many resources to its drone program, to its conventional cruise and ballistic missile program, and it's not clear that the sort of policy response has been commensurate with that threat. So I will maybe stop here and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Valerie. What I'm going to do is ask each of you a question or two, trying to fold in questions that we've gotten from the audience. And let me just say again, if you want to ask a question, please feel free to enter them into the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or send us an email at policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Again, that's policyforum, one word, @washingtoninstitute.org. Anyhow, there was an article in the New York Times about 2 days ago about the challenges the U.S. has faced with its allies in the EU and elsewhere in trying to staunch the flow of computer chips to Russia. Okay, and in the article they mentioned that in 2021, companies shipped over 1 trillion computer chips to customers around the world, which gives you kind of an order of magnitude sense of the scope of the problem. So let me ask, I want to tie together this discussion with the other debate about artificial intelligence. And I want to start with Valerie if I can. And again, I apologize if this is, but this is kind of on the line of kind of export controls and kind of keeping track of stuff and where it's going. Might it be possible to develop kind of like, kind of miniature radio frequency ID tags? I mean, there are actually tiny RFID tags that are used kind of to track the flow of various things around the world, mainly for logistics purposes, for shipping and the like. Is it possible that, is this viable with computer chips, you think, or is it, the fact of the matter is we know where the black hole is. It's largely China, as you said in your presentation and also in the report. And therefore, in the end, if there's no companies in China that are willing to continue tracking this stuff, even if we had a viable tracking means, for given the amount of computer chips that are produced, it doesn't matter because we know where the problem is. So are there technical or technological things that we could do in order to better track traffic, identify points of diversion, and therefore direct policy effort to try to close those? Or is this, are you skeptical of this? And again, I apologize if this is a little bit kind of, I'm just trying to, I'm a layperson when it comes to this kind of stuff, so I'm trying to kind of figure out if there's things we haven't thought about or that might be doable with some new technologies that are being introduced.
I think you directed this to me. I think
Yes,
that's,
yes.
I'm going to say that would be extremely challenging. I see Damien smiling, so I'm assuming that he is in agreement with this conclusion. I think it would be better to focus in on ways in which the destinations, the routes, the sort of focal points where this trade is happening, the way in which manufacturers engage and use distributors. It seems to me that it would be better to focus on sort of those efforts than imagining that you can sort of specifically track individual components that are traded at this volume. There may also be ways in which you could use like codes that are related to just general customs tariff codes that are used to classify items in the context of trade. If there would be a way to kind of more specifically identify where these particular components of concern fall within the tariff code, and so that countries would be aware of that and could do a better job of tracking it. But of course, that's leaving aside the fact that if you're sort of an unscrupulous supplier or purchaser, you may not necessarily use the proper code when you're identifying what you're purchasing. So there are a lot of, I'm just going to say there are a lot of problems that come to mind, even with the suggestion that I'm making, but I'll stop there because I think Damien may have something to add here.
Damien, did you have anything to add? Or if not, I was going to ask you the second question anyhow. So
nothing to add. I think these are very, very good points that Valerie is making, and I'm totally in agreement.
Okay, so let me ask, there aren't many people who have gotten their hands on Shahed 131s, 136s, Mohajer 6s, and been able to actually take them apart. So can you give us a sense, when I look at them, I see, pictures that the Iranian media, kind of puts on their websites, really an effort to have a high quality finish in terms of the presentation of the weapon. They look like they're quality products. Can you tell us from, what you learned, and you've been kind of taking apart, weapons in various theaters for over a decade now. Can you tell us what you've learned about the people who design these and put them together? Is there a high, what's the quality control like? I mentioned, the trillion chips that are traded each year. How many chips on average? And again, I don't know if you've ever done a count in a drone. How many chips do you find in an average drone? So like if it's like, if it's like 10 or 50, that's hard because it's not a large number. But if an average drone requires a few hundred, then again, it's that's something else. So could you give, and also on the issue of the bronze metal technology, do you get a sense from looking at their handiwork that they're content with good enough, or are they would they strive to kind of do better if they could do better, or simply it's just not worth it from the point of view of good enough is good enough, and better to put the additional effort to producing an additional drone or two than to making fewer drones that are better? What's your sense, having kind of taken them apart and looked in the innards?
That's a lot of questions there, Mike. So we find usually quite a few dozen chips in drones, depending on the models. Those Shaheds will have, I think, about maybe 100 in them. We'll have Russian drones that are more complex. So it really, really depends. I think I would echo General McKenzie's kind of admiration for, the let's say proficiency, ingenuity of the Iranian drone program, especially comparing, those used in Ukraine with those that we found previously in the Middle East, seeing, how quite complex they are and, well thought, and caveating that we have a small sample in Ukraine, only about 20. We've already found variation and adaptations that, tell us that, there are people there that really think about those things and can really, do it well. So that's pretty admirable, I think, in that sense, technically speaking. In terms of quality control, it's actually quite, funny in terms of anecdote that you should mention this, because I've never seen any systems with as many stickers saying quality control on them as the Shahad and Muhajir. So it seems this is kind of maybe an Iranian obsession with their drone program to put stickers, QC stickers on almost everything. And funnily enough, also like warranty void if open kind of things, which I'm afraid we have to open to see the components in them. But I think they're quite stringent and serious about their quality control. If we have to trust the stickers. Yeah.
Thank you very much, General McKenzie. I'd like to draw you out a little bit more about your comments about counter drone efforts. First of all, can you tell us why did the strikes on, your assessment of why the strikes on the Aramco strike succeeded? Because there were air defenses, air and missile defenses in the area, so to speak. Could you give us a little sense of why they were not successful? But can you also tell us a little bit more about the successes? It seems to me that the curve, the curve in favoring the defense has been improving. The intercept rate has been improving in what the Saudis are claiming, and if you could talk a little bit about that, that'd be great. What the Ukrainians are claiming, but so it seems like we're making progress in terms of our ability to intercept drones, as you mentioned, but it seems that we're still on the wrong side of the cost imposition curves. That these things are still so cheap, and we choose very expensive solutions. So, is there any way that we could perhaps get on the other side of the curve and produce bronze metal, counters drone capabilities, so that we could produce larger numbers and improve our chances? Or is our system unlikely to produce bronze metal technology in numbers sufficient to ever really successfully deal with this challenge?
Hey, Mike, set of good questions. Let me begin with the attack in September 2019 against Aramco. That was the Iranians had a good plan. They knew where air defense systems were. They knew had a generally good understanding of the fans of those radars, and they were able to waypoint the drones. And a waypoint is this: it's a thing that's very attractive in a drone. You can tell it to fly to a different point on the earth and turn to fly to a different point. So they don't fly a straight line. They can fly a dogleg course. They can fly a variety of complex turns to get to the target, and that's what they did in this case. And they did it very well. Sometimes sometimes the adversary has a good day, and this was good planning by them, and it was an extremely well executed attack. Now, when you go back and you look at archival data on some of these radar sites that are out there, they saw it, but they didn't know how to interpret it, because sometimes a drone that's flying low is not readily interpreted by a radar operator at a remote site. So you learn from that. But in the case of the Aramco attack, it was a very well executed attack. And you may recall that I think there was some discussion initially about the Houthis claiming responsibility for it. And so that was part of the large Iranian design. The evidence was significant and overwhelming that they were of Iranian origin. But I would just note to you, and I'm glad we were talking about the way to find responsibility for these attacks. Sometimes nations don't want to know actually who was behind that attack. They'd rather to have it be hang out there in limbo. And we've seen that a couple of times in attacks in the Middle East, when it's easier to blame the Houthis, or easier to blame some other third party, rather than to frankly admit that the evidence is forensically is overwhelming that it was an Iranian attack. So now, how do you learn from that? How do you get better? So you're absolutely right. We are on the wrong side of the cost imposition curve. We are spending lots of money to shoot down very, very cheap platforms that are coming in. And how you get better at that is you really need to come up with a way. I hinted at it in my prepared remarks. You really need to come up with a way to engage them across the entire lifetime of the enemy weapon. And we've already talked a little bit about ways we can get at it before they get an opportunity to launch by denying them the capability to build the weapon. But then what you want to do is you want to engage that weapon as far out as you can. That way you have other opportunities to go after it. You do that by having good broad area surveillance. You've got to have good radars that will take a look at it. Now, unfortunately, sometimes that means you need airborne radars because you're looking at a drone that's going to fly very close to the earth, and just radars are line of sight systems. So you're limited with what a fixed site ground radar can do. You have a lot more flexibility if you can fly airborne radars that look down and that have been tuned to discriminate and act to avoid the radar return and can take a look at these things. So you can do that. But that, unfortunately, that's an expensive solution. That's a very expensive solution. But it also would give you a very good radar paint on these targets. You know, you want to do things in signals intelligence. Not much more I can say about that. Where you get an opportunity to listen to the drone, perhaps interrogate a GPS satellite. Where am I? Where am I going? That's a way to take a look at it potentially. Those are all possibilities. Those go away if the drone is completely inertial. And now inertial systems, we've used them for a long time. They're very good. There are weaknesses in them. The weaknesses become more significant over the flight time of the vehicle. You know, it maintains it's all internal, so it can't get a fix. It can't get an update on where it is. So that you get some error into those systems. But it's also harder for the defender to go and find those. So when you get down to very close to where the potential target might be, now you're down to air defense artillery, guns, cannons that can fire, some very good systems out there that'll work for that. You're down to other things like obstacles in the air. You put up nets, other things for smaller drones that actually physically prevent the drone from flying in on the target. Cheap. That's relatively cheap, but it's it's also an eyesore. Depending on where you are, you may not want to do that. Look, the bottom line is this, though. We are still you made another point that the curve's going up. Yes, I think the Saudis are if you look at the totality of engagements from the Houthis, the Saudis had a better than 50% intercept rate. In some cases, significantly better intercept rate. And the problem is some of those intercepts involve, a fighter aircraft with guns or with missiles, again, which is very, very expensive going after these systems. But I think, 50% is not good enough. You need to be up in the 90-95% range against these systems. I think Ukraine is having good success with them too. I don't track those numbers like I was able to track the Saudi numbers, but there's a learning curve on defense where you get better. Now, the offense will react again. And the way to do it is, I think the trend is going to be smaller systems launched closer to the target. That means you got to transport them there, perhaps covertly to a location where you can just pop it up, throw it, and get it going. And if you put 50 or 60 of those in the air, you can afford to have 40 of them shot down if the other 20 get to the objective. Now that limits you on what you can hit. It's not going to blow up a protected building. But if you just want to hit a hospital, and many of them do, it certainly would be effective against a hospital or a building that's not protected. So I will tell you this: it's a very dynamic space out there right now. I believe actually the U.S. Department of Defense is doing very, very good work with our allies, trying to find ways to get to defense of this, because it is a profound challenge. It's been a profound challenge in the Middle East for a while. We see it anew in Ukraine. It's going to be a part of the battlefield for many, many years into the future. And I'm pleased with the energy that I see in the Department of Defense working against it.
Thank you. We're going to do one more round of questions here. So I'm going to start with Valerie. And I'm going to ask, this is something of a heretical question, so forgive me, because by and large, I'm very supportive of arms control and export control regimes. I think they're very important. They played a very important role. So I'm not an anti-arms control or export control regime guy. But let me ask you this. Has the MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime, reached a point where it's not constraining the bad guys, but only the good guys? And that maybe if some of our, partners had more capabilities, they would have had in this area to respond in kind against the Houthis or Tehran, there would have been a different outcome given the U.S. lack of willingness to respond in the cases, for instance, with the Aramco strike and then the attack on the UAE in February. So so please give me what your thoughts about that. Has the MTCR outlived its usefulness, or do we need to double down and just do it better?
Never going to say anything bad about the MTCR. I think we just have to have realistic expectations about what it can achieve, particularly when you think about, Russia as a member of the MTCR. This is a cooperative group that, changes the control list based on consensus. So, expanding the list of MTCR controlled items, it's not going to happen. China is meant to be, though it's not a formal member, is meant to be sort of adhering to the restrictions of the MTCR in its transfers. So let's just be realistic. The MTCR is not the tool that's going to achieve what we're looking for in terms of limiting Iran's drone expansion, limiting Russia's drone expansion, limiting the use of drones on the battlefield. There has been some discussion in the export control community about the value of maybe a new type of export control regime, sort of modeled on the COCOM idea, where you would be focusing on, and I think that some of the trade control related actions that have been taken by the United States and its partners on semiconductors and other things is a good model for this. You think about sort of the nature of the threat, where you want to be focusing your efforts, and you kind of design a regime with like-minded countries to try and control those items and do a better job of controlling them. I don't think when we think about drone technology, we should be looking to the MTCR or even the Wassenaar arrangement for the solution on the export control side. I can't speak to the extent to which that has or hasn't limited the response of our allies in dealing with some of the threats in the past, but I do think that looking forward, it's a good baseline. It has a lot of benefits, which I won't get into here, but it's not going to be the solution. But I think there are multilateral export control solutions that exist, and I think that the way that COCOM was organized is a good way to think about that, is in terms of sort of broad technology denial to our enemies.
Thank you very much. Emma, if we could load the slide from last night that I sent. I have a question for Damien based on a bar graph that appears in the report that was done in November of 2022 regarding Iranian drones and the date of the year of manufacture of components documented in Iranian material in Ukraine. So we'll be just bringing up a slide that I just would like to talk to in a moment. Okay, it's coming here. There you go. Okay, so this is a great slide. I love this. This is from the Conflict Armament Research report that shows the year of manufacture, and you see the year of manufacturers on the bottom of various components documented in Iranian material in Ukraine, in Iranian drones that were recovered in Ukraine. And I just want to show you something, because I, as a policy guy, look at this and I say, what stands out, what's interesting to me is that during the period of maximum pressure, which was 2018, 2019, beginning of 2020, then you had the transition in administrations. You actually saw a dramatic increase in the presence of components built or manufactured during those years. So the policy debate usually goes that, and actually I've advocated for this, that if you strengthen sanctions, it reduces the amount of funds available to engage in procurement. And we know that very often, procurement of prescribed items, and as Valerie said, not all of these are prescribed items, but procurement of prescribed items is often very expensive because you have to engage in smuggling. There's middlemen and middlewomen maybe that have to be paid and the like. So if you cut down the amount of funds available to them, it'll cut down on their ability to engage in smuggling and procurement. But what this chart might show, and again, I want to be very careful because it's a very limited number of, I think there were like 4 UAVs that you had access to, if I remember correctly from the report. So I don't want to exaggerate, maybe this is a skewed sample, but it seems to show that during the period when our sanctions, intensified, and maybe actually from their point of view, the increased threat led to redoubled efforts to engage in smuggling and to divert resources that were necessary to engage in the smuggling. But what does, do you see from your experience, and you've been doing this for a decade, a relationship between kind of efforts to increase pressure on people engaged in building these kind of weapons and their ability to acquire prescribed components? Is there a direct relationship, or this would indicate possibly an inverse relationship, which is just very interesting from a policy point of view. Do you have any kind of insights from your experiences in this regard that reinforce this point, or that are contrary to this point, perhaps?
So I thank you for pointing out that this is a very small sample, and the type of work that we do is very opportunistic. That means that we don't have access to everything that is ever being recovered, and we cannot possibly document everything either. But it gives an indication still of how recently those chips had been manufactured, which is interesting in this case. What I'd like to point out is that any sanction and export control mechanism will only be effective if there is a field monitoring component in it. You need to be able to open up the systems. You need to be able to document the components, figure out what they need, how they got them in the first place, and what they might replace it with once those acquisition channels get cut by sanctions and by export control. If you don't have that, you can't possibly hope to have effective control. What I think this shows here is that up until we opened up those systems in 2022, and up until they showed up in Ukraine, there was no realization of exactly what components needed to be targeted, what entities needed to be targeted by export controls and sanctions. So I wouldn't necessarily see a direct correlation or an invert correlation between increased in pressure and more acquisition of components in those years. What I would see here is just that up until now we were a little bit operating in the dark, that we were making sanctions without exactly knowing which entities were getting which components and how they would replace them later once we would target them.
Thank you very much. And General McKenzie, this is this is our last question here. I want to ask you about the comment that you make in your report, and that you also made during your presentation about future war with Iran, which of course we hope will never occur. But if there is a future war with Iran, it's more likely to be a war of not a war of maneuver, but a war of fires. But then you have a quote in your piece that fire without maneuver is indecisive. So but there's other people who say that actually drones, and you make the point that you have to take drones together with cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, actually have created, they are now actually, some people say, true conventional weapons of mass disruption, if not mass destruction. So are they really game changers that allow perhaps military decision without maneuver, or are you still a skeptic in this regard? And how do you see, again, we hope this doesn't occur, but if there were to be a war, say, involving the Israelis and the Iranians, Iran is moving forward with its nuclear enrichment program, getting close to what probably most people consider an Israeli red line in terms of weapons grade uranium. How do you see that kind of potentially unfolding? Is this something which is open-ended, or a short-lived thing that Iran acts openly initially in the response and then morphs to kind of the gray zone, like they did in responding to the killing of Qasem Soleimani, an overt response that's decisive and clear and overt, and then morphing to kind of revenge attacks, using proxies or terrorism or whatever?
Sure, Mike. Some good questions there. Let me begin with the idea about, it's an old axiom of combined arms warfare that fire without maneuver is indecisive. Maneuver without fire is disastrous. So let's look at the history in the region. In the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq war, both sides resorted to city busting, attacking each other's cities and populations. And while your operational situation was relatively static and fixed, I think that's a great example from the theater of the inherent indecisiveness of this kind of warfare. And I think that's what so I draw lessons from that. I also think, look at Ukraine right now. Ukraine is imposing great cost on the Russians with fires. They have not yet been able to maneuver against them. Unless you're able to couple the two, it's hard to get decisive results. Now, there's an exception to that. I mean, if you start talking nuclear weapons, everything's very different, because now you're talking destructions of entire societies. But I would stay below that level in this discussion. That's another discussion, one worth having, but not in the context that we're talking right now. So I think it's still inherently indecisive. Now, the trick would be, and a countering view might be, well, you can impose enough pain in a counter value operation, counter value meaning it's code word for killing people in cities, in that kind of operation, that you would bring the other person to the table. Well, actually, history doesn't tell us that that's what happens. Populations are able to ride out these attacks. We saw it in the Second World War. The results of the U.S. strategic bombing study are very illustrative there as you look at the effects we had on bombing in both Germany and then later in Japan. Now, you could raise it to the very highest level, and then there's possibly a knee in the curve. I'm not sure anybody wants to get to that knee in the curve. So I think it's a complex relationship. But I do believe if you're just going to resort to a fires war, it's going to be very difficult to get to ultimately a decisive solution. You may get to a solution, maybe even a solution that gives you part of what you want, but you're not able to get to the rest of it. So now, talking about how I think drones, certainly they're here to stay. They're going to proliferate. We're going to see them increasingly used in all forms of air-to-air combat. Eventually, you're going to see manned planes and unmanned aircraft that are going to operate together. Perhaps one is, perhaps the drones answering to the manned platform. So I think those types of things are inevitable as we go down the road. I do not believe, though, that is going to fundamentally change the nature of warfare. It's going to change some of the characteristics of warfare, but I don't believe it's going to fundamentally change it. There will be countermeasures. There's people who say right now, for example, citing events in Ukraine, the tank is dead. Well, the tank's not dead. There's still going to be a need for protected maneuver, and the tank will be able to be protected against drones as we go forward. There's solutions out there to that right now. Again, it goes back to, it's offense, defense, the eternal calculus. Someone seizes an advantage, sees a technological avenue that they can exploit, but there will be a response. And often the response is more effective than the original attack.
Okay. General McKenzie, Valerie, Lincy, Damien, Spleeters, thank you very much. I've learned a lot and very much appreciate your contribution to the discussion today. Wish you well, and everybody, until next time, thank you.
Thanks, Mike. It was great. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.